There's no deal to be had here. The Europeans and Ukraine have made it unequivocally clear that they reject out of hand all of the major Russian demands. And from the Russian perspective, those demands are non-negotiable. So there's nothing to negotiate here. Trump is wasting his time, and all of this discussion in Europe is nothing more than theater. This one's going to be settled on the battlefield. Period. End the story. In simple terms, this isn't negotiation. It's theater. When demands are non-negotiable on one side and rejected on the other, talks mean nothing. At that point, outcomes aren't decided at tables. They're decided on the ground. There is little doubt that the Trump administration wants to significantly reduce our military footprint in Europe, and it wants to shift the burden of dealing with Ukraine onto the shoulders of the Europeans. And more generally, it wants the Europeans to provide for their own security. The European countries, that is. And I think that is the very least of their goals. I think a number of them, and I would imagine this is Trump, would like to put an end to NATO and just get out of Europe altogether. It'd be politically very difficult to do that at this point in time. But I think if Trump had his druthers, that would be what he would like to do. In simple terms, this is about responsibility shifting. Donald Trump doesn't want Europe to depend on American power forever. He wants Europe to pay for and manage its own security. Ending NATO outright may be politically impossible, but reducing America's role inside it, that's clearly on the table. He's trying to antagonize Europe, maybe to make them want us to push us out. Or do you think that he's not really thinking strategically in one way or the other, and is just saying whatever comes to his mind? Well, he often does say whatever comes to his mind, and that's what makes it very difficult to figure out what he's really thinking on certain issues. I think on this particular issue, he has long wanted to improve relations with the Russians and concentrate on dealing with China. This was his goal during his first term in office. He wanted to abandon engagement and develop a containment policy toward China. And at the same time, he wanted to greatly improve Russians' relations with the Russians. But as you remember, what happened was that Russiagate got in the way, and it was almost impossible for Trump to improve relations with Moscow. Then he came back to office this time, and of course, he's continued to focus on containing China on one hand, but now what he wants to do in the second term is what he didn't do in the first term, which is to improve relations with Russia and put an end to the Ukraine war. But that, of course, means that he runs head-on into resistance from the Europeans, and his basic view is screw the Europeans. Right? And I want to reduce my commitment to Europe anyway. And they can take care of themselves. In simple terms, this isn't chaos, it's priority. Donald Trump wants to shift focus away from Europe and toward China while cooling tensions with Russia. The problem isn't intent, it's execution. His blunt style alienates Europe faster than strategy can realign it. So what looks like improvisation is really a long-term goal delivered without diplomacy. He basically views the Europeans as free riders. He thinks that, they've been free riding on the US military presence in Europe for a long time. His view is let them provide for their own security. So I think what you're headed for here is more of a pivot to Asia, in this second Trump term than you saw in the first Trump term. In simple terms, he sees Europe as a free rider from Donald Trump's perspective. Europe relied on American security while underinvesting in its own defense. So the logic is your own security, while the US pivots toward Asia, where Washington believes the real strategic contest now lies. I think that if the Europeans were smart, and if the Ukrainians were smart, what they'd do, is they'd get on an airplane, they'd fly to Moscow, and they'd cut a deal with the Russians. They, of course, would have to basically concede, most of Russia's principal demands. This would be very distasteful for sure, but at this point in time, it is the best alternative. It's a lousy alternative, but it's the best alternative. And then I think the Europeans should go to great lengths over time, to restore good relations with Russia. It's in their economic interest, and it's in their strategic interest, for sure. But the point is, Danny, you cannot sell this argument to the Europeans. You can't sell it in the mainstream in the United States, and you certainly can't sell it to the Ukrainians. This is the problem that Trump faces. This is the uncomfortable. Wants to say out loud, a bad deal now may be better than a worse outcome later. But politics isn't about what's optimal. It's about what's sellable. And conceding to Russia is a non-starter for Europe, Ukraine, and Washington alike. That's the bind Donald Trump is trapped in. The rational option exists, but the political will doesn't. So what's going to happen here is that Europe is going to continue to pursue antagonistic policies towards Russia. Russia, in its response, will pursue antagonistic policies towards Europe. It will try to divide Europe in terms of dividing the various countries and causing divisions within specific countries. It will do what it can to undermine transatlantic relations. Of course, the Europeans will retaliate against the Russians. And this will all be played in the shadow of a Ukrainian-Russian competition that's guaranteed to go on for as far as the eye can see. So you're going to have poisonous relations in Europe for the foreseeable future. And this is not in Europe's interest. In simple terms, this is a slow poison. Europe and Russia are locking themselves into permanent hostility. That means division inside Europe, strained transatlantic ties, and a conflict that never really ends. It just simmers. And the irony is brutal. This endless antagonism hurts Europe more than anyone else. If you go inside the European Parliament, and you talk to people, what you discover very quickly is that people on the left, and here we're talking basically about the far left, and people on the right, and here we're talking basically about the far right, are in favor of the sorts of arguments that people like you and I make about how to solve this war. But the great unwashed middle, the center in Europe, and in the European Parliament, is adamantly opposed to reaching any kind of agreement with the Russians, and they want to continue the war. When you listen to people, Macron and Merz, and the British Prime Minister talk, what you are hearing is basically what you hear when you talk to most European parliamentarians. This is the real paradox inside Europe. The political edges, left and right, are open to ending the war, but the center holds the line on confrontation. When leaders like Emmanuel Macron or Friedrich Merz speak, they're echoing that establishment middle, not public exhaustion. History shows it clearly. Wars often continue, not because people want them, but because the center of power refuses to let go. These are people who are Russophobic to the core, and want to continue to have an antagonistic relationship with the Russians. And this is despite the fact that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and that Europe has no way of rectifying the situation. When you listen to these people talk, you would think that they have some magic formula for fixing the situation in Ukraine, rescuing the Ukrainians on the battlefield. But they don't. They have no way of shifting the military ballots up on the front lines. And furthermore, now that the United States is unwilling to give large amounts of economic aid to Ukraine, the burden of doing so has been shifted to the Europeans, and the Europeans do not have the money to give to Ukraine to keep it afloat. So when you marry what's happening on the battlefield with the economics of this situation, you just scratch your head and say, why aren't the European elites trying to do something to shut this war down? Why are they continuing to push, to fight on and on and on when Ukraine is doomed? I don't understand it, to be honest. In simple terms, this is ideology colliding with reality. European elites remain hostile toward Russia. Even as Ukraine loses ground and options disappear, there's no military fix, no economic lifeline, especially now that the United States is stepping back. So, what's left isn't strategy, and denial is the most expensive policy, 10-11 of all. The idea that the Russian 10-13 economy is going to collapse, and that is the war-winning weapon, is not a serious argument. And furthermore, at the end, he's talking about the United States, Europe, and Ukraine working together. The United States is bailing out. Trump is shifting the burden to the Europeans. And as I said, the Europeans do not have the economic or military wherewithal to make up for the absence of an American presence in the overall equation. As you know, Danny, the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians together, those three actors together could not defeat the Russians. And along comes Trump. And Trump wants to take the Americans out of the equation as much as possible. He doesn't want to spend more money on Ukraine, and he's willing to send weapons. But only if the Europeans buy those weapons and ship them to Ukraine. So the Americans are basically being equation. How do the Europeans make up for that? And the answer is they can't. They are all those European countries are in worse economic shape today than they were in 2022 when this war started. The German economy, the French economy, and the British economy are all in serious trouble. The French and British economies have serious debt problems. They can't raise the money themselves to make up for the lack of American economic support for Ukraine. This is why these countries are talking about stealing Russian assets, which is, opening Pandora's box. Yeah, they want to steal these Russian assets because they have no money of their own to give to Ukraine. This just shows you how desperate the situation is. But again, you have people like Macron who talk in ways that make you think they're delusional. This cuts straight through the illusion. The idea that sanctions alone would collapse Russia was never serious strategy. Now the United States is stepping back under Donald Trump, and Europe is being asked to fill a gap it simply can't afford. No money, no military capacity, no plan. That's why talk of seizing Russian assets has surfaced, not from confidence, but desperation. When economics fail, norms are the next casualty. But President Trump and his European counterparts are basically at war with each other. I mean, this is not a military war. It's a war of words, big time. Trump, let's face it, Trump's contempt for the Europeans in general and for the European leaders knows no bounds. He says things about the European elites that none of his predecessors would ever have said. It's really quite remarkable. He loathed them. And of course, they loathe him as well. And you can't blame them. If you're a European leader, and you listen to Trump talk, you're going to get very angry, and you're going to want to say bad things about him in the way that he says bad things about you. So you have sort of an esque here between the two sides that shows no signs of ending. And by the way, Danny, just to take this one step further, at some point, as you and I both know, a war in Ukraine is going to be lost, and it's going to be a devastating defeat for NATO. That's going to happen at some point. And then the blame game is going to set in, right? Who's responsible for this disaster? And the Europeans, of course, will want to blame Trump for bailing out at the last moment. They'll make the argument that we had the Russians on the ropes. They were not doing well on the battlefield. Their economy was collapsing, and Donald Trump pulled out. He bailed out on us, and that's why we lost. Trump, of course, is going to great lengths not to completely bail out, because he wants to be in a position to say, first of all, this was Joe Biden's war, not my war. And secondly, it's only appropriate that the Europeans played the principal role, but I want you to understand that. I supported the Europeans, and I was willing to give them any weaponry that they wanted. What you're seeing here isn't alliance politics. It's mutual resentment. Donald Trump and Europe aren't coordinating anymore. They're positioning for blame. When the war in Ukraine ends badly, and history suggests it will, the real fight begins, not with Russia, but within the West itself. Who lost it? Who quit first? Who pays the political price? This isn't unity under strain.